it's a pleasure to be with everybody here today, at least virtually. You know, we're here in person. I had the opportunity to come up to Anchorage for the National 8A Association's regional conference, and am delighted to be able, back before I head to Kansas City, to join obviously my friends from the Alaska PTAC to present today to government contractors on past performance. My name is Matthew Schoonover. I'm the managing member of Schoonover and Moriarty, and we are a Kansas City-based law firm that works exclusively with federal government contractors. And as part of that, we help small businesses in particular with all of the fun things that come from working with Uncle Sam. We'll counsel them through regulatory compliance issues, FAR compliance, contractual compliance, small business regulations. We will also work with them on mentor proteges, joint ventures, and teaming arrangements, as well as performance disputes in the protest process as well. But as part of our practice, one thing that we always enjoy doing is helping businesses become more competitive or to increase their competitiveness for federal government contracts. And in today's era, that is very, very important. And past performance, as we'll see, is becoming a crucial evaluation factor really for any project that you do. So it's important today that we talk about how your small business might increase its past performance to take advantage and become more competitive for those awards. As part of our discussion today, we'll first talk about what is past performance. And although it sounds pretty strict.
Can I jump in on
Sure,
that for
absolutely.
just 1 second? Sorry guys, excuse. I just want to make sure. So there's nothing worse than interrupting someone's presentation. Okay, can somebody do a raise hand button? Can you all hear me? Can you hear Matt? Oh, thank you, Rachel. Okay, beautiful. Sorry, Matt.
Oh, no, that's...
Log into monitor and it's saying nothing started.
Oh.
Which would be even worse than me interrupting.
Well, then I would get a dry run too.
Yeah,
so, you know.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll start off today by talking about what is past performance. And although it sounds fairly straightforward, it's oftentimes not so simple. And so we'll talk about primarily the distinction between experience versus past performance as it comes to federal government contracts. If past performance is an important evaluation factor for federal contracts, we'll talk about how the government monitors or measures your past performance, and then how it evaluates that past performance under competitive opportunities. And then finally, you know, we'll talk with that information, we'll talk some ideas as to how your firm might put its past performance to work. We'll discuss a few issues or a few ways that you might increase your past performance, as well as leverage your existing past performance to become more competitive for awards. And then, of course, we'll have time for questions at the end. Now, before we break too far into the topic, I did just want to pause to give a plug for our blog, govconbrief.com. On GovCon Brief, our firm discusses a lot of these topics and how they are important to federal government contractors. So if you haven't yet subscribed to GovCon Brief, I'd certainly recommend that you do so. We hope it's a resource for your business as you compete for federal government contracts, no matter the industry. So with that, let's go ahead and break into what is past performance. And as I mentioned at the outset, past performance kind of sounds like experience. Well, what is your experience performing various jobs? And how will that impact your performance on these jobs? But it's important to know that experience and past performance are distinct concepts. Yes, they're related, but they are distinct from one another, at least when we talk about them under federal contract evaluations. Experience asks the question of, do you as an offeror, have you performed similar work in the past? That it's kind of a binary yes or no question. Have you performed on relevant projects in the past? Past performance, though, takes it a step further and says, how well did you perform on those projects in the past? That is, based on your performance of recent and relevant work, how likely does the government think that you will successfully perform under this contract? And as I mentioned, there's two real key components to that. The government is going to review recent and relevant work that you have performed in the past. And recency, both of these terms will be defined in the particular solicitation. But recency is usually a measurement of work that is performed within a certain amount of time from bid submission. A lot of times it's, contracts that have been performed within the last 3 or 5 years, or maybe are still being performed right now. There's usually a measure of recency involved in this discussion because the government is more concerned. It's kind of like the "what have you done for me lately?" The government wants to know of the jobs that you have most recently performed, is that performance successful? Because if so, it's going to consider those recent projects to be more instructive for this project. The second consideration is whether that experience, or excuse me, that past performance relates to work that is relevant to the particular solicitation that you are bidding on. And relevancy is a little bit of a subjective concept. The agency is going to consider projects that are similar in size, scope, and complexity to the solicited work. So we're talking about things like, are they of comparable dollar values? The contracts, are they of comparable dollar values to each other? Do they involve roughly the same number of full-time equivalent employees or the same number of performance locations? Is the work, if it's construction work, for example, is it a design build project, or is it work at a VA healthcare facility? These type of issues that the agency might look and say, this type of work is more relevant to this job than other types of projects that your company has performed in the past. And again, these will be defined under the solicitation, whether a project is recent or relevant. And then the government will have some type of subjective evaluation, mostly subjective evaluation, to determine whether or not that work is recent or relevant. And again, based on that performance, how well you performed under those jobs, the government is essentially going to predict how likely it is that you will successfully perform under this effort and make its evaluation determination based on that assessment. So
I'm going to be rude again.
no problem.
Let me get rid of a few things off your guys' screen, just so that we can actually see. There we go.
Excellent. Excellent. So with that understanding of what past performance is, let's talk now about why it matters. And if you have experience working with the federal government, I'm sure you've noticed this before, that the federal government is awarding more contracts on what we call a best value basis of late than it is on what we call a lowest price technically acceptable, or LPTA, basis. When the government considers contracts, there's generally 2 evaluation schemes. It's best value or lowest price technically acceptable. And under a lowest price technically acceptable bid submission, price is going to be the predominant factor. The government's going to look to who bid the lowest possible price, and of that offeror, did they meet certain bare minimum technical requirements? That is, it doesn't matter if a higher price necessarily came along with added technical benefits. Under an LPTA evaluation scheme, low price is really going to drive the show. Under a best value evaluation scheme, though, that reverses, where the government says, listen, we might evaluate, or we might award a contract to an offeror that has a higher price if it's advantageous to us to do so. If that offeror provides certain technical benefits, or does that offeror have a stronger likelihood of successful performance on this contract based on an assessment of their past performance. The FAR says that for most competitive acquisitions, the government has to consider whether an offeror's past performance as part of that evaluation, meaning it needs to make that assessment between offerors to see who in its mind it thinks is more likely to successfully perform under the contract. That is a requirement for most competitive acquisitions. It's not necessarily the same, though, for, say, commercial item acquisitions or procurements with subcontracting plans. Past performance should be an element of that evaluation, but should doesn't mean shall, and oftentimes, or sometimes, excuse me, the government may not consider past performance under those evaluation schemes. But the vast majority of times, it's going to consider past performance under the evaluation, particularly now since we are seeing more and more solicitations being issued on a best value basis. As an aside, as part of that, the government is continuing to roll out policies and regulations that essentially precluded or prohibited from issuing solicitations on a lowest price technically acceptable basis, except in very limited circumstances. We've seen this kind of rollout start with DoD, where Congress, as part of the past few National Defense Authorization Acts, was instructing the Department of Defense to not issue procurements on an LPTA basis. The thought being, well, if the government's buying, you know, body armor and bullets and all of that type of stuff that's going to keep our troops safe overseas, maybe those contracts shouldn't necessarily go to the lowest bidder. Maybe they're willing to pay a little bit more for a higher quality product. And we've seen that rollout continue. And recently, just this past year, in fact, the FAR was updated to now prohibit LPTA contracts under all agencies that are subject to the FAR, except in very narrow circumstances. That is, those cases where the government is able to say, hey, you know, a higher technical score isn't going to give us any benefit here. I always give the example of ballpoint pens. If the government's buying ballpoint pens, it's fine buying those under an LPTA basis because, you know, a regular old stick pen is going to provide the same performance as, you know, a fancy schmancy pen. So in limited cases, the government can use LPTA contracts, but that is becoming more and more restrictive. I think that's important for small businesses because in my experience, small businesses might not be as flexible on price on a competitive contract, but in most cases, they sure as heck offer innovative benefits. So if you're a small business and you're considering a contract that's issued on an LPTA basis, you might ask the contracting officer why it's issued on an LPTA basis and encourage the contracting officer to change that to best value based on the new FAR requirements. And if you have any questions about that, I'm certainly happy to answer them. But I tend to think that as a general matter for small businesses, best value tends to be a good thing compared to LPTA. So with that understanding of what past performance is, let's talk about how the government measures your past performance. And here I want to note at the outset, when we talk about measurement, that's a distinct concept from how past performance is evaluated. So when we talk about measuring past performance, how is the government going to monitor your performance while you are actually performing a contract and use those ratings for future evaluations under new contract opportunities? So let's talk first about how they score or how they grade your past performance. And essentially, that's through a monitoring effort. The government, either the contracting officer or the contracting officer's representative, is going to monitor your performance throughout and give you a grade card, what we call CPARs, or your contract performance assessment report scores for each performance year that you are performing under your contract. And these CPAR ratings, or these grade cards, are required for just about every federal contract opportunity. If your contract or your order exceeds the simplified acquisition threshold, which right now is $250,000, you're going to get a CPAR report, or you should get a CPAR report for that contract in each year under it. If you have a construction contract valued at $750,000 or more, you're going to get a C par rating for that. And if you're performing under an architectural engineering contract valued at $35,000 or more, again, you should get a C par rating. These grade cards, these C pars, are compiled by the government every contract period and are then kept in a database that is accessible to government contracting personnel to review as they are evaluating new contract opportunities. So what is the government going to assess when they issue these C par ratings? Well, it's essentially every aspect of your performance. Of course, they're going to measure your technical compliance, how well you are actually performing under the job, that quality of your performance. Are you meeting the deliverable requirements? Are you exceeding the deliverable requirements? Are there any performance issues that have needed to be addressed under the contracts? That's going to be one of the major components. Cost control under certain contracts is also going to be evaluated, not for fixed price contracts, but if you have a cost reimbursable contract or a time and materials contract, cost control will also be graded under these C par ratings. Your adherence to various schedule or timeline requirements for the contract is going to be assessed, whether there have been any delays under your performance or any missed deliverables, anything like that is going to be graded as well. Your management and business relations, how well you are working with the government, the involvement of your management, corporate management and project management under the contract is also going to be assessed. In some cases, if a subcontracting plan is required, whether or not you're meeting those compliance requirements. But then the catch-all is anything else that the CO thinks should be evaluated, they have a right to evaluate under your C par contracts. And they're going to be issuing these grades under an adjectival scale. The FAR identifies exceptional ratings, very good ratings, satisfactory, marginal, or unsatisfactory ratings that a contracting officer may choose from. Thank you, Jody. And as part of that, the government generally must include a supporting narrative as part of its evaluation. A lot of times the government doesn't necessarily do that, and I tend to think that, or in my anecdotal experience, excuse me, the government is less inclined to submit a supporting narrative if your scores are good. They tend to include narratives more if you have marginal or unsatisfactory ratings, because a lot of times they're venting, and which can be unfortunate. But really, I tend to think that if you are performing under one of these contracts, hopefully you'll know in advance whether the government's about to issue you a marginal or unsatisfactory rating. That is, it really shouldn't come as a surprise to you, because odds are the government has already communicated the fact to you that for whatever reason, it does not believe that your performance is up to snuff under the contract, and that any efforts to resolve those performance issues also have kind of fallen short. So really, I tend to think that marginal and unsatisfactory ratings shouldn't be a surprise, and if they are, it reflects that there's probably been a breakdown in communication between you and the government along the way. Another thing, and perhaps one of the most important things that the government has to include in its ratings of you is a recommendation, and it's a checked box that says yes or no, or recommend or don't recommend, that whether they would actually recommend you or whether they would hire you to perform similar requirements in the future. And that checked box actually does carry a lot of weight with the government when they go to evaluate you on future opportunities. If the government is saying no, we wouldn't hire them to perform similar requirements, that's really tough to overcome, even with a good technical proposal. And so you want to make sure you want to evaluate these ratings that the government is giving to you and pushing back as appropriate. What I'm showing you now is a table, and this comes straight from the FAR, the Federal Acquisition Regulations, and this defines the various adjectival ratings that the government can provide under a C par rating, and you'll see them on the screen. You know, we've highlighted some of the key parts, but an exceptional rating is exactly what you would think it would be, where you are exceeding many of the requirements to the government's benefit, and if there have been a few problems under the contract, have addressed them in a way, quickly addressed them in a way that has been highly effective. And that contrasts with an unsatisfactory rating, which also should come as no surprise. And that is basically performance has really not been good, and your efforts to fix whatever problems there have been under the contract, and there have been a lot of them under the ratings, have been unsuccessful, and you just haven't been able to overcome those issues and put performance back where it needs to go. Those are the bookend ratings. We see that in between there's some gradation of each of those requirements, and here's kind of where the subjectivity comes into play. You know, we see words like many and some, major or minor, you know, satisfactory versus effective. These are all kind of subjective thoughts from the government, or subjective ratings from the government, that don't really have a ton of objective markers. That is, what is many requirements that are exceeded under the contract, and how does that compare to some? Is many 5? Is some only 5? You know, how does the government evaluate these? And this can be the trick to CPARs, is that sometimes a contractor says, well, my performance has been great, I'm exceeding all of these deliverables, and the government might come back and say, well, yeah, you've exceeded some, but not many, or not a lot, or whatever. And so there can be some subjectivity here, and we'll talk in a little bit about how you might get these ratings to your advantage. But when an agency is assessing past performance, as I mentioned, it has to complete one of these CPAR ratings each year under contract performance. And then once work is complete, it's going to issue what we call a final CPAR, that is kind of the conclusion rating as to how well performance has been performed. But it's important to note that the government's word on these is not the last word. Under the FAR, you do, as a contractor, get the right to respond to the ratings that the government puts out. And presumptively, it's a 14-day deadline to respond after you receive the evaluation. But keep in mind that the contracting officer may either shorten that deadline or extend it beyond that presumptive 14-day period. I always recommend that contractors provide some type of comments in the evaluation, to the evaluation. This is certainly true if the government is providing a negative evaluation. You know, you want to provide your rebuttals to that information. But also in the case where your performance has been great, you know, providing some information about your efforts internally to make sure that performance is continuing to exceed expectations certainly couldn't hurt, because again, the government is going to see all of this information when they go to actually evaluate your performance. Importantly, if you disagree with any ratings, you know, the government will submit this to, should be the CO's boss. It should go to one level above the CO for final consideration before the final CPAR is issued, to see whether or not those ratings are justified or should be changed. In my experience, those ratings aren't changed a lot. So the contractor may submit a rebuttal, or may submit disagreements to the contracting officer's ratings and narratives under there, under its CPAR. And a lot of times, you know, the contracting officer's boss might just roll with it. There have been a few instances off the top of my head, though, where the CO, the level above the CO review has resulted in a changed CPAR rating. And so, although cynically, I think it's tempting to say, well, nothing's going to change under these ratings because the government's just, you know, gonna circle the wagons and affirm the CO's ratings. I think it is still important to put those rebuttals on the record for the government, because even if you dispute it through the claims process later on, which again we'll talk about, in the meantime, the government is at least getting an alternative narrative if it goes to evaluate your performance under a future effort. One thing I will say about submitting disagreements with this is please keep it professional. Make sure that you have a good tone, because again, the final the final audience for these CPAR ratings is perhaps another contracting officer under a different evaluation. And if we have nasty comments going back and forth between the agency and the contracting officer, even if you're right about everything that you put in your ratings, I think it's hard for a contracting officer to look at that and say, this is really a company that I want to work with, just based on the tone, based on how everything is handled. Certainly responses to evaluation ratings, I think, need to be done in a professional manner that adequately explains why you disagree and believe that your performance exceeded the expectations, without a lot of, you know, attacks on the CO or the CO's management or anything like that, because I ultimately don't think those get anywhere. Once the contracting officer's boss considers those comments, then it's going to give the final ratings. Those final ratings, as I mentioned, will include your comments on there, and it's these final ratings that an evaluation team under a future opportunity will consider when determining, you know, whether the impact of your past performance under this project. Importantly, though, and I can't stress this enough, is CPAR ratings are confidential. They are not subject to public disclosure. So although you can log on to the CPAR rating and find your own evaluation ratings and respond to those, other contractors may not. Rather, that is internal government information that is designed to aid under future source selections. And so other other contractors, excuse me, should not have access to that information. So if they do, for whatever reason, you need to find out why. But also you need to make sure that you are not disclosing your CPAR ratings publicly yourself too, unless you think there's a benefit to doing so. But keep in mind that those are confidential information and ordinarily can't even be FOIA'd for disclosure as well. As we consider who is assessing your performance or the government's assessment of your performance, again, the government is going to ordinarily assign the contracting officer as your assessor. That's part of the contracting officer's role. But sometimes they can delegate those functions to other individuals that are also on the job. We see contracting officers' representatives fill that role often. And that makes sense because most of the time a COR, for example, may have more day-to-day interaction with you than a contracting officer who in many cases might not even be on site. They could even be in a different state, just having management authority over your contract. So a lot of times this might go to a COR or somebody else that's even on site to handle these. The point here is that you always want to try to maintain good relationships with as many government contracting personnel involved in your projects as you can. That is a very simple concept that is oftentimes easier said than done. People are people, obviously, and not everybody's always going to get along. And that's totally fine. But again, to kind of go back to the point of the last slide, if there are disagreements, you want to make sure that they are done as professionally as possible, because you never know who is going to be involved in that evaluation process. And I think just, you know, it never hurts if your evaluator, you know, at least likes you and wants to work with you. That's never a bad thing. But if there's an animus there, if there's a bad relationship there, then, you know, just kind of human nature is odds are they're going to be more inclined to give you a bad rating, and perhaps even if it's not as objective as it should be. So keep that in mind as well. Now that we know that how past performance is assessed under your current contracts, how is the government going to grade your past performance for future contract opportunities? And again, the past performance evaluation is essentially an assessment. You know, it's the government's assessment of the likelihood of your successful performance under this opportunity based on your experience under similar and recent opportunities in the past. These are subjective evaluations by their nature. However, that doesn't mean that the government can act on a whim. There are still evaluation criteria under the solicitation that they have to follow. They, if they announce what is a recent and relevant project, the government can't depart from that under its evaluations. They have to adhere to those definitions. But within that, again, there is some subjectivity there. However, if it is evaluated on a pass-fail basis, then that generally for small businesses is considered what we call a de facto responsibility determination. If you're a small business and the government issues a pass-fail or an unacceptable experience or past performance evaluation, you might have a decent argument that that determination should be referred to the SBA for what we call a certificate of competency. That is, the SBA under the Small Business Act has conclusive authority to consider a small business's responsibility to perform under a federal government contract. And if an evaluating agency believes that you as a small business are not responsible, it has to refer you to the SBA to actually make that determination. That's important because the SBA has the ability to consider information even outside of the proposal to determine whether you are actually responsible to perform that work. So keep that in mind as well if the government determines you to be unacceptable on a pass-fail basis. What will the government use to actually evaluate your past performance under a contract opportunity? Well, obviously, I mean, we just spent a lot of time talking about a CPAR rating. Yeah, they're going to use those ratings to determine your past performance. They're going to log in to the government's side of the CPAR portal and search you by DUNS number or search by contract opportunity when you disclose that in your proposal to pull up those CPAR ratings and see what those are going to be. And then based on those ratings, do they believe that you will successfully perform this effort? Importantly, the government can also consider information outside of those CPAR ratings. A lot of times we see past performance questionnaires or PPQs that are required to be submitted with a particular proposal. And a PPQ, in contrast to a CPAR, is where you send an evaluator this questionnaire about your performance, and then that evaluator sends that information to the government to consider as part of their evaluation under this new contract. And those PPQs can be submitted for various types of opportunities if the solicitation allows. That is, we've seen them as part of commercial contracts. We've seen them on other federal government contracts. We've seen people rely on PPQs for work that they performed as a subcontractor as well. But you could be required to provide that information to those contacts on those other projects who will again then fill out those forms and send them to the government. If the government does require PPQs, make sure that your contact actually sends them into the government and to the correct place within the government for consideration under the future opportunity. If they don't, then the government generally isn't at fault for not considering those PPQs. That is, the government generally is not under any obligation to follow up with individuals to say, hey, send us those PPQs. It's really on you as a bidder to make sure that that information is submitted. So you want to make sure that it is. They're also going to consider other information that's available to the government. Here I'm thinking of particularly the Federal Awardee Performance and Integrity System, which is kind of the internal database. It's merging now into SAM, but this is where it's going to show any non-responsibility determinations, any terminations for default or cause, any suspensions or debarments that you might have in your record as well. It's going to look in that information too to determine your past performance score. Finally, in a lot of solicitations, includes a catch-all right to essentially review any other information relating to past performance as it relates to the solicitation's effort. What that looks like depends on a variety of factors. This is, again, a catch-all, and I think the government uses this more to reserve the right to look at extraneous information about your company. Say maybe, it does a Google search, and that Google search reveals some bad information about your company. It can technically consider that information as well that it learns through that Google search. And we've seen that happen to companies in the past, where even though it was not something that was included as part of their proposal, the government had a clause like this under the evaluation factor and was able to use that extraneous information as part of their evaluation. So keep that in mind as well. A little bit of Google hygiene never hurts, you know, any company if they've got reviews or anything out there as well. The government may also, beyond your company, it might look to any subcontractors that you have. That is, the government under the FAR has the right to consider past performance information of major subcontractors, predecessor companies, and even key personnel that you propose under the project. I say it has the right to consider that information, but it doesn't necessarily have the obligation to consider that information. And again, here you'll want to take a look at the solicitation evaluation factors. Sometimes we see it defined as, you know, hey, the government will consider the offeror's past performance under recent and relevant jobs, and it will define what recent and relevant are. Sometimes, though, the question becomes, well, what is an offeror under this project? Do they mean the prime contractor, or do they mean the offeror's team? And these are things that, as you're bidding on opportunities, you should really consider, you know, what these definitions are, if they are even defined. Sometimes they might not be defined. You might need to follow up with the contracting officer to say, hey, will you consider the past performance of our major subcontractors or of our key personnel under this effort, to try and get their approval to doing so. But as I mentioned, the government isn't necessarily obligated to consider that information. And so it might say no. It might come back and say, no, we only want to consider the prime contractor's past performance as part of this effort. And we've seen that happen in the past. So in that case, what might you do? Well, you might consider a small business joint venture, because unlike the FAR and the ability to consider subcontractor past performance, SBA's regulations say that when an agency is evaluating a small business joint venture, it must consider not only that joint venture's past performance, but also the past performance by any of its individual constituent members. So if you and another business are considering teaming on a contract, and you're going to use that teammate's past performance on a job, and the solicitation says, no, we're only going to consider the prime contractor's past performance as part of the evaluation, you and that small business should probably consider forming a joint venture to bid on the opportunity, because there the government would have to consider both venturers' past performance as part of the evaluation. What happens if it's a large business? Well, it still might work, but you would have to have what we call a mentor-protege relationship in place with that large business, then form a joint venture with that large business to bid on this work and take advantage of that provision. And we could, if anybody has any questions, we could talk about that as well. But keep in mind that even though SBA's regulations say that the agency has to consider that past performance, sometimes agencies get tricky and say, okay, fine, we'll consider that past performance, but we're going to give it a little bit of a lower weight than we would to prime contractor past performance. Generally, that weighting assigned to those various past performance examples is a matter of reasonable agency discretion. If that happens, you might consider, well, is this determination unreasonable? If so, is it something that maybe we should consider challenging as part of a pre-bid protest? Maybe, maybe not. I think it all depends on how crucial that past performance is to you and what that weighting afforded to it will be under the particular solicitation. So that is, in a nutshell, past performance, what it is, how the government grades it, and then how they evaluate it under future contract opportunities. But let's get to the meat of today's presentation. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end by design, and that is, how do you leverage your past performance as a small business to make sure you're putting yourself in the best possible competitive position? And this point is is I think the most elementary, but oftentimes actually the most overlooked when it comes to past performance, and that is good performance ratings begin with actually performing well under the contract. You want to make sure that you're setting yourself up to have good past performance ratings through the contracts that you're actually bidding on. That is, a lot of times we see contractors kind of, when we get involved in the process and maybe a client is explaining why they maybe have a bad or a not so favorable performance evaluation under a contract, it usually involves a discussion of, well, the work was more complex than we thought, or the scope wasn't quite what we believed it would be, or we think that the scope changed under the contract. There's always kind of some component of that involved. And so you want to make sure that you understand contract objectives, contract requirements, contract deliverables before you actually decide to bid on that opportunity. Because otherwise you really run the risk of biting off more than you can chew, which of course is going to set you up for potential bad performance evaluations. Sometimes, you might be in a position to win a really large contract that might stress your company kind of to the max. And although it's great to win that contract because maybe it's going to help you grow and really lead to a lot of revenues for your company, what happens if your largest contracts or one of your largest contracts has a not so great past performance evaluation assigned to it? An agency might look at that and say, okay, are they really able to perform under this type of opportunity? So you might consider taking a gradual approach, particularly if you're a small growing business, so that you're setting yourself up to have great past performance evaluations and use those to leverage contracts of a higher and higher value from there. I also think it's important to make sure that the contracting officer understands the contract objectives for the work that you're bidding on. That sounds silly because most folks think, well, yeah, they're the contracting officer. It's the agency. Of course it knows what it wants and what it wants contractors to do under the contract. As my friend Lee Corso from College Game Day would say, not so fast, my friend. We're 2 weeks away from college football. Is anybody else excited? Contracting officers don't always understand what's going on in the contract. There are a lot of times where folks start performing the work and it is clear that even the agency didn't really know what it wanted under this effort. It thought it knew, but maybe if there would have been more discussions at the outset, or maybe if there would have been a little more critical eye from both parties, some contract performance issues could be avoided, or some contract headaches could be avoided. And it's, of course, those issues and those headaches that tend to lead to bad performance evaluations under a contract. And so making sure that the contracting officer understands contract objectives before you bid, I think is very, very crucial. Take advantage of the site inspections if they're available, the Q&A process if it's available to you. Heck, even if the Q&A process has closed and you have a question about the contract, ask it anyway. The worst the government's going to do is not respond, and then you're in no worse position than you are now. But if you ask it and it's a good question, the government might look at it and say, yeah, we didn't think of that. And in order to make sure that folks know what we want, and in order to make sure we know what we want, we're going to answer this question. We might give folks more time to bid on the work as a result of that. Consider a pre-award protest, or what is more accurately called a pre-bid protest, if you think that solicitation terms are vague or are unclear or are unduly restrictive of competition, if they're too strenuous or stringent upon a contractor. Consider those alternatives rather than just bidding on the work as is, because really once you bid on that work and once you're awarded the contract, the government's going to not really care if after the fact you come in and say, well, we didn't really understand it. or you know, we thought that this term didn't really matter in the contract. You want to make sure that there's commonality, that there's a meeting of the minds between what it is the contract is expecting and how you will be graded for your performance under that. I cannot stress that enough. Once you actually win that contract, it's important to keep the lines of communication with the contracting officer open. Yes, you will be speaking with the COR and other folks that are on site, but the contracting officer is really the grand poobah when it comes to the contract. You want to make sure that they are apprised of what is going on under the contract. If there are reports that need to be sent, make sure you're just copying the contracting officer on them as well. If you think that there have been changes under the contract, make sure you're communicating those with the contracting officer as well. A lot of times it happens that maybe the COR is on site and says, oh, well, here, contractor, I want you to do this instead. And that's not quite what your contract says. Okay, but keep in mind that only the CO, the contracting officer, is authorized to make any deviations to the contract. So I always tell folks, just follow up with the CO in writing. You can copy the COR on it, but just say, hey, you know, we were talking with the COR today, and it was decided to do this with regards to performance. Please let us know if you disagree. If you think there's going to be a change in the deliverable time or in cost to that, tell the contracting officer as soon as you can. In fact, the FAR requires you, in some cases, to immediately inform the contracting officer if you want compensation for any of those changes. So I always tell folks, hey, you know, we talked to the COR, they want us to do this instead. We think there's going to be an impact to time and costs. We're still assessing what those are, and we'll follow up with that information to you ASAP. And then actually follow up with that information. Say, you know, and keep them updated. It doesn't necessarily have to be definitive. You want to make sure that you're maintaining that open communication with the contracting officer and that any significant discussions are memorialized in writing. Because I'll tell you, after the fact, it's very hard to reconstruct those discussions, even if it's one of those discussions where, well, everybody agreed to do this. Everybody might have agreed, but if it's not in writing, did they agree? Or how did everybody have a common understanding of what they were agreeing to? So make sure that you're communicating those in writing to the contracting officer. Especially make sure that you're documenting issues that might be affecting your performance. If you're delayed in performance at all for any reason, you want to make sure that you're contemporaneously documenting those delays, including those issues, including any time or money that you might be owed as a result. If you're able to mitigate damages or move personnel around, you want to document those issues too. And again, for that type of stuff, make sure that you're at least keeping the CO informed. You can keep more detailed notes internally, but you want to make sure that you're keeping the CO informed in writing as soon as possible on them. Then finally, consider a request for equitable adjustment or even a claim to address any of these issues. Because if you've submitted a formal request to the government to address these issues and believe that the contract should be changed in some way or that you're entitled to something under the contract, it's harder on the back end for the government to issue a CPAR rating or a performance evaluation that kind of faults you for those issues. So if there are anything, or if there is anything under the contract that might be affecting your performance, again, document that early, request relief from the government as soon as you can, because the sooner that's resolved, hopefully the sooner you'll be getting good CPARs as a result of those as well. Similarly, when it comes after you've earned those good past performance ratings, how are you going to use them under a new contract? Well, just as the point before, you need to understand what the work is requiring before you bid on it to earn those ratings. You also need to understand what the current solicitation is requiring when it comes to past performance to make sure you're able to leverage those ratings. That is, you need to know what the government considers to be recent or relevant work, and those should be clearly defined. You know, size, scope, and complexity when it comes to relevant work, those should be objective measurements that you can look at it as a bidder and say, yes, I meet these requirements. Those need to be clearly defined, and if they're not, you need to get the contracting officer to provide some objectivity to them. You also need to understand whether you can rely on a teammate's or your key personnel's past performance under this job. Again, we discussed a few slides ago that the FAR says you should be able to, but does the CEO agree with that for this particular solicitation, or have they limited it to only prime contractors? Because that determination is gonna impact how you ultimately decide to bid the opportunity. Also, if the contracting officer is assigning a weight to that teammates or that key personnel's past performance, you want to know that as well. What is that weight? Because if a teammate is getting less weight under the evaluation assessment than the prime contractor would, and you have another example of strong past performance that you think could be included under the project, you guys might say, listen, I understand, subcontractor, why you want your past performance to be considered as part of this, but even in the best case scenario, you're only going to get 80% of the score that we would for this other opportunity. So let's make sure that we're submitting only our opportunities for this effort. Similarly, can you as a prime contractor submit past performance that you gained as a subcontractor under a different opportunity? SBA is changing its rules to say that in some cases, a small business may be able to rely on the work that it performed as either a first-tier subcontractor or a joint venture partner to establish its past performance on a new opportunity. That's not a hard and fast rule yet. And again, there is a little bit of play in those joints. But in theory, you might be able to use that experience that you've gained as a subcontractor on another opportunity. So again, consider whether that solicitation allows you to do that. And then if not, what is your recourse from there? Can you ask the contracting officer to allow you to use it? Can you consider a pre-bid protest under the circumstances to maybe help leverage that or force them to allow you to use that information? These are all considerations to keep in mind. Also, can you rely on past performance that you gained under commercial projects? A lot of times past performance, the majority of the time past performance is only going to consider work that is performed for the federal government. But sometimes the government says, yeah, we'll consider commercial projects, again, if it's recent, if it's relevant, that type of stuff. And so you want to understand whether the solicitation allows you to do that. And if it's vague, or if it's not clear in any way, consider asking the contracting officer for clarification, or even to change the terms. Again, when it comes to solicitation terms, my general thought is it never hurts to ask, especially when the right answer might help. And if you would be in a better position if the solicitation was changed in some way, you've got really nothing to lose by asking the CEO to change it. And if it's important enough, again, consider the opportunities when it comes to a pre-bid protest to challenge those terms and maybe force some change to them. How, one question I'm often asked, and this might kind of be getting to the meat and potatoes of today's presentation, is that all sounds good, but I'm a small business. I don't really have a lot of past performance to rely on. So what can I do to build my past performance? How can I make sure that I'm earning past performance to win under these future awards? And at the outset, I'm going to say something that sounds silly because it ultimately is. Not having past performance isn't technically a negative under the FAR and under the evaluation scheme. It's what is considered a neutral. That is, if you don't have a record of recent or relevant past performance, the government isn't supposed to give you a bad grade. They're supposed to give you a neutral grade when it comes to past performance. But that's semantics, because in the case of two offerors, you and a competitor, if you have a neutral past performance rating and your competitor has a good past performance rating or even a satisfactory past performance rating, and everything else is equal or pretty equal, I'd bet you dollars to donuts the government's going to go with the offeror that has some record of decent past performance. And that's unfortunate. And we've seen that happen in the past. Now, I tend to think, well, if it's semantics only, then is the government practically assigning a negative grade to us? That is, if a neutral rating, if a better rating is, or if a good rating is viewed better than a neutral rating, is it truly neutral? And GAO, the Government Accountability Office, has recently considered this question. And they said that yes, it is neutral. Just because somebody with a good rating is rated better than you doesn't mean that you were given a bad rating. It just means that they were rated better. And so we're seeing that although, you know, you might not necessarily get a negative score from this, the practical effect can be that you lose out on a contract if you don't have a record of decent past performance or of good past performance. So how do you develop that past performance? Well, you know, one thing that we've seen recently is that, again, the FAR allows an agency to consider the past performance of key personnel that will be performing on your behalf under an opportunity. So one way to gain past performance is to hire experienced personnel and to put them in management roles under your contract. Okay, Matt, that's easier said than done. I'm a small business, I'm trying to earn my first contracts. I don't have the budget to necessarily go out and hire these tremendously experienced personnel and leverage them with the hopes that I earn a federal contract. That's a fair point. So what are some other alternatives that you might have? Well, one overlooked alternative and opportunity that we always see is I think a lot of times small businesses really focus on the prize of a prime contract. Consider subcontract opportunities. Consider developing your experience through working as a subcontractor on federal government opportunities. Odds are you have connections in your industry with companies that serve as prime contractors. What can you do to get your foot in the door with them and to maybe get a piece of the pie on a federal government contract? I've got clients, by the way, that are very successful businesses, and all they do is subcontract on federal government contracts. So don't operate under the delusion that to be successful, it ultimately has to be your name as the prime contractor. Depending on your industry, you can really carve a niche as a subcontractor, and a lot of times you're sought after as a subcontractor, particularly if you have a socioeconomic designation that you might be able to leverage in that. That is, if it's a large business, federal government contractor, odds are they have to have a subcontracting plan. And as part of that plan, they have to subcontract a certain dollar amount or a certain percentage of that work to small businesses or small businesses with any of the various socioeconomic designations. And so if you have those, you might be able to leverage that and say, okay, you know, Lockheed Martin, whatever large business I'm working with, I'm a woman-owned small business, and here's what I do. Here are my capabilities. Let's work together under this project. And you get the benefit of having me on your team and checking that box. I get the benefit of getting a little bit of work and helping to build my past performance. Think about those opportunities that you might be able to work on. And you know, I tell you what, Carolyn and Jody and everybody else at the Alaska PTAC, I know are a great resource as you're pursuing those socioeconomic designations. They'll be able to sit down with you and talk about what it is you might qualify for in those steps. And I think if you haven't had that discussion yet, you're missing out. I would certainly encourage you to do so. Again, also consider more direct teaming and joint venturing to augment your past performance. If you're bidding as a prime contractor and you lack past performance, can you team with an experienced subcontractor? Yes, it might mean that you have to give up a part of the work, but 60% of something or 50% of something is better than, you know, no percent of everything. So if it means that you're more competitive to winning that opportunity, consider subcontracting. And don't just subcontract with any company. Be picky about who you subcontract with, because as a prime contractor, it's ultimately you and it's your reputation on the line. It's your CPAR rating on the line. And you don't want to subcontract with somebody who's going to flake out on you or not be able to perform the job well. Be picky when it comes to teaming. Again, consider joint venturing or mentor-protege relationships with more experienced companies as well, particularly with larger companies. If there's a larger company that's out there, maybe consider ways that you guys might work together under a mentor-protege relationship, whereby you as a small business will get some business development assistance from them, including the opportunity to enter into a joint venture relationship with them and still bid on small business contracts. That's a tremendous incentive. For a mentor, their eyes light up because now they see a contract opportunity that they otherwise wouldn't be eligible for. But as a protege, you get the ability to work with them and to use their past performance to help earn that contract and to really leverage their past performance to make yourself more competitive for that opportunity. And for the government, if they understand what a mentor-protege joint venture is, if you've got a large business or a really experienced business in that joint venture with you, and they look at it and they say, hey, I get a small business participation credit here. I get to check the box for my goaling. But at the end of the day, I know that this company who's involved in this relationship, this experienced company, is going to make sure that they perform the contract well. That's a win-win for the federal government. So as we can continue to see small business opportunities become more and more consolidated into fewer and fewer contracts of a larger and larger or greater and greater dollar value between them, even aside from the past performance context, I tend to think that if you're a small business and you're not giving serious consideration to joint ventures or mentor-protege relationships, you're missing out on a real important way to increase your competitiveness on awards that are increasingly competitive. And again, reach out to the PTAC to really discuss these options. Reach out to me to discuss these options, because I tend to think that they really are the wave of the future. And we talked about this too for socioeconomic programs. You know, and when we say socioeconomic programs, we're talking about the 8A business participation program. We're talking about service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses, the Hub Zone program, and woman-owned small businesses. Those are the socioeconomic programs when it comes to federal government contracts. For state contracts, there might be others or similar socioeconomic programs of a different name. But those four are really the key socioeconomic programs for federal government contracts. And under each four socioeconomic opportunities, the government has the ability to reserve competition among those members of that group, or even in some cases to issue sole source awards to members of that group. So socioeconomic programs are a real good way to build your past performance, because what they do for these set-aside awards is it means that it's a smaller competitive pool. Rather than bidding against small businesses in general, or unrestricted competition in general, maybe your business is only bidding against other woman-owned small businesses or other Hub Zone companies, other 8A companies, or other SDV/OSB companies. You've automatically reduced the competitive pool, and by default, increased your chances of winning that award. And so keep that in mind too, that those, you know, certainly those will help you with subcontracting, but they also obviously help you with prime contracting opportunities as well. Again, give serious consideration to these socioeconomic programs. Another way to build your past performance, once you have it, is to address any concerns that an agency might have about your past performance record. You know, if you've got a CPAR rating that's been assigned to you that's not so great, it doesn't have to be bad, but maybe it's not so great. Address that before a new solicitation is issued. That is with the assessing agency. Make sure you're communicating with them over potential negative CPAR ratings. Submit your comments to those ratings. You know, explain why you believe that you should receive higher ratings. Ask to discuss them with the contracting officer. Sometimes they agree to change ratings. Seek ADR, what we call alternative dispute resolution, or even file a claim to challenge those ratings. We'll talk about that here in 1 second. But after a new solicitation is issued, once you're bidding on a new contract, once you know what is required under that contract, if you've got past performance ratings, you know, that are following you, they're kind of like, you know, the permanent record that everybody had in grade school. You know, it follows you on your permanent record, although it's not so permanent. It lasts, you know, what, 5 to 10 years, 7 years, I think is for most CPAR ratings. Once you know what the solicitation is requiring, use your proposal to rehabilitate any past performance concerns that another agency might have had. That is, you know why an agency issued you a not so friendly CPAR rating. They said it right there in the CPAR, or they were discussing it with you throughout your performance. One thing that you might consider doing is specifically addressing those issues as part of your proposal. Past performance is, again, a measurement of how likely the government thinks you will successfully perform on this effort because of your record of recent and relevant performance under other efforts. So if the government issued you under a prior rating, a not so friendly CPAR, maybe you say something along the lines of, we understand that the government issued us only satisfactory ratings or marginal ratings in this aspect of our CPAR for this particular contract based on these concerns. However, we've learned from that, and here's how we've addressed those concerns so that you know, government, this won't be an issue under this contract. Preemptively rebut those issues. Give the government something to think about. If you're not learning from CPAR ratings in the past and demonstrating that you're learning from those ratings, yeah, the government's probably not going to be as sure of your successful performance under this effort. But if you've learned from past issues and can document to the agency, here's what we've done, here's what we've implemented, here's what we've learned from this, that's a pretty good rebuttal in that case. It might not win the day, but it at least gives the agency something to think about, you know, considerably more than just ignoring it would. I also mentioned that you can challenge past performance evaluations that the government has issued you. If you think that the government is just far afield or they've unreasonably issued you a negative past performance evaluation, consider your options to challenge those. And don't get me wrong, this can be expensive, you know, particularly if you go through the claim process, particularly if you get lawyers involved, although some lawyers are more reasonable than others. It can be expensive. It can be time consuming, but is it better than the alternative of losing contracts because of this past performance evaluation? That's a business call for you to make, but it's something to think about. You know, if you are going to challenge a past performance evaluation, I always encourage folks to start informally. Start by requesting, you know, a meeting with the contracting officer to address the issues and to say why you think that a different rating is appropriate, and come with receipts, as the kids say. You know, make sure that you're actually documenting it. You know, give them an objective reason to change the rating rather than just a subjective rating of, well, this evaluation is going to harm us going forward. If they think that you performed poorly under a contract, they're going to say, yeah, that's kind of the point of a CPAR rating. It's because you perform poorly under this contract, the government wants to make it harder for you to win future contracts. So you need to come with objective information to them, demonstrating why you met or exceeded the solicitation requirements. Then if those discussions don't pan out for whatever reason, consider escalating from there to either the request for equitable adjustment or even the claim process under the Contract Disputes Act. And a claim is exactly what it sounds. It's a written demand to a contracting officer for something. Sometimes it's money, as some certain, other times it's some other type of relief. And in this case, it would be a changed CPAR rating. And you would essentially challenge that rating as arbitrary and capricious for some reason, or otherwise failing to follow the FAR's requirements or their adjectival definitions for those particular evaluation ratings. The claim would go to the contracting officer, who would consider the merits of it. Sometimes, you're asking the contracting officer to change what they've already done. And if you've gone through this process, the claim is kind of a perfunctory hoop to jump through before you have to go to an appeal. In an appeal, you can either go to the appropriate Board of Contract Appeals or even the Court of Federal Claims, where a judge or a panel of judges will decide whether that evaluation was arbitrary and capricious. And if so, either direct the agency to change it in some way, or maybe issue a new rating themselves. It's more likely that they would remand it to the agency to change it. But again, here, when you challenge these things, you need to be objective as possible. Sometimes changed CPAR ratings happen in the context of broader claims. Usually there's a claim for delays or a claim for money that's going on as part of this. If there's a disagreement about the scope of work, maybe the government issued you a CPAR that said, hey, they didn't perform, scope of X under the contract, so they get bad ratings. And your response is, well, the contract didn't require us to do X. It required us to do X minus 1 or X minus 2. So if you want us to do X, you need to give us more time, you need to give us more money, you need to give us a contract modification, whatever the case may be, and you need to change our CPAR ratings. Sometimes you can do a little bit of horse trading, where you might say, I'm not going to get that much money from the government anyway, the CPAR is more important to me, I'll use the money as leverage and then maybe get a better grade as a result. That's all part of the strategy that goes in as part of these claims, but in some cases there can be a way to get the agency to change them through the claim and potentially appeal process. Finally, bid protests. If your past performance is evaluated as unfavorably for a future or for a contract that you're bidding on, you might be able to challenge that rating through a bid protest process. That is, you'd be challenging the evaluation of your proposal and of the award of a new contract as part of that bid protest process. And oftentimes those protests raise arguments that, hey, the agency's past performance evaluation departed from the solicitation's evaluation criteria in some way. Maybe they didn't appropriately consider the recency and relevancy of our performance under the stated definitions. Had they done it, our score would have been higher. Or maybe they didn't appropriately consider our subcontractors' past performance. It looks like they gave it less weight under their evaluation when the solicitation didn't say that it would do that. Maybe there are ways to challenge the evaluation of your past performance under a proposal evaluation. You might also be able to challenge the evaluation of the awardee. Maybe the evaluation was unequal in some way, or was unfair in some way, or flawed in another way that benefited the awardee. Maybe it considered awardees projects that weren't relevant or recent, or it did not consider evidence of poor performance under another contract. Maybe your competitor had a contract that was terminated for default, and you know that because the government put it out for recompete. Or maybe there's information online about it, as the case may sometimes be. That could be information to challenge an awardee's past performance. And so there could be ways under a bid protest to challenge the evaluation of past performance. And certainly we're seeing those protests be more and more common. That continues to be one of the most common ways or most common reasons that GAO sustains protests. But even short of a sustain, the agency might take corrective action to reevaluate proposals. But as we are seeing, to kind of bring it full circle, as we're seeing best value procurements become the norm and become more and more popular, and past performance to be a crucial evaluation factor under those evaluation schemes or that evaluation scheme, we're seeing bid protests challenging past performance evaluations become more and more common as well. So keep that in mind as you consider your past performance. Now with that, I know we have a lot of time left on the books for questions. I'm certainly hopeful that you'll take advantage of it. I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody might have. Maybe it's about past performance, but maybe it's about other small business contracting issues. And so with that, if there's anything, I'm happy to oblige.
Okay, Matt, do you mind if I invade your personal space a little bit?
Please do.
Because I gave you my control computer.
Oh, excellent.
And because I gave the control computer, I haven't been able to monitor for questions. So hi, everybody. This, again, Jody with PTAC and Carolyn in the back corner. Hi, Carolyn. I got you on camera. So one of the things that I didn't do fairly for all of you attendees is I panicked that I was running late. We needed to get started. And I didn't do a good intro, and I didn't give Matt a chance to introduce himself as well. And one of the things I didn't do is talk about your GoToWebinar. There you go. We'll so much.
It's all three of us.
Yeah. But I didn't explain the GoToWebinar panel. So one of the things I want to point out real quick is there are handouts you can download. So if you wanted to make sure to gather the slides, you can download those handouts. And if you can't, just email me, reply to your invitation, and I'll make sure to get those out to you. And there's two ways you can ask questions. And we have the time, and we have incredible talent all the way from the other side of the world visiting. Of course, that's just my opinion. If anybody has to do the 12-hour, trip to the East Coast, it might as well be other side of the world. But we have this talent and experience here, so please, by all means, take advantage of that. So if you want, and you don't want to type it, just click raise your hand, and I'll be glad to unmute you, and then the mic is yours. So there's a lot of good questions to be asked. There's a lot of material that was covered, and I'm sure your brains are clicking away.
Unless I just answered everything.
There is that. That's my assumption, that if there's no questions, then I was so brilliant that nothing else was needed. Can you not? Can you not? So please, let's take advantage of that as well. So I don't see any, but like I said, feel free just to click the raise hand and let's get some discussion going. If not, I have questions. So I'm going to let you have camera too.
Okay.
And do you guys really want me to take up your time when you have an opportunity to ask these questions?
Well, and I will say too, my contact information is on the screen. So please take advantage of that. It could be that maybe you don't have a question now and you think of it later, or that it's something completely different than what we've talked about today, but federal contracting adjacent. Feel free to reach out with any questions. Send me an email, give me a call. You can reach out on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to answer any questions. So please, don't be shy.
That happens to me all the time. I have to let everything kick around the brain pan. It's like, oh, why didn't I think of that? Or as you come into those circumstances while performing day-to-day opportunity. So I'm gonna let you have camera because camera just confuses me. I get all sucked in. I'm the deer in the headlight with the camera. So I do want to ask a couple of questions since we have a few minutes, and you guys are being quiet from that end. See what happens when you let somebody talk? Okay, last chance for Harry Stan. Well, one of the things I wanted to ask you is when we're talking about assessing that past performance in the CPAR, and you've had a very successful contract, what is that time for CPARs? It can be up to a year. There's these delays, there's a timeline. How can you encourage getting those entered quicker to make them applicable for upcoming work?
And that's a wonderful question. It's one that we've had a lot. And it goes back to, I mentioned earlier that with the narratives, in my experience, the government is more apt to put the narratives in for bad performance than sometimes they are for good performance. It also works that sometimes the government's just more motivated to fill out a CPAR rating itself if you've been performing poorly under a contract versus if you've had great performance. And you know, some of it can be chalked up to contracting officers, CORs, all of those. They're very busy folks, and so you know, sometimes filling out a CPAR is just another piece of paper for them to look at and fill out. So I get that, but as a contractor, you're entitled to those ratings.
Absolutely.
And you want to make sure that the government is filling them out. And I forget the time frame off the top of my head for the government to actually do so. But if there's a delay, or if you have an opportunity that is coming up that you think, boy, this project is recent and relevant, it really checks all the boxes, I've done well performing under it, I'd love to have this CPAR rating in there because I think it would make me more competitive. I always encourage folks, reach out to the contracting officer.
Absolutely.
And just let them know, say, hey, I understand you're busy, but we do have this opportunity that's coming up, and we would appreciate, you know, a CPAR rating that reflects what we believe is our great performance under this contract. And if there's anything we can do to help you so that you can fill this out, please let us know. But we would really appreciate it. And I have found that more often than not, just a simple ping, and maybe it'll take a follow-up, but that is certainly something that I always encourage folks to do. I have in the past had to, as an attorney, come in and do a little more of the disappointed dad tone with contracting officers, which my son is 7 and my daughter is 4, so I'm getting really good.
Oh yeah.
At that tone, and that makes it sound like my kids are disappointments. They're not at all.
No, yeah. As a parent, you have to learn that it's survival. So what we're telling you, audience, is there's a survival technique of when do you need to have that tone or that that weight added to the urgency of your communication.
Yes. And sometimes maybe the CO just forgets, or they say, yeah, that's next on my list, or it was down at the bottom of their list, and they don't understand. They think that there's some time for it, whereas a contractor, you're kind of really anxious to get it out there because you've got this bid coming up. If you explain that to them, and if you've really been performing well under the contract, I think most of the time contracting officers are certainly accommodating in that case. Maybe the contracting officer, though, you don't have a great relationship with, or just don't have much of a relationship with. If you have a good relationship with the COR and talk to them on a daily basis or what have you, talk to them about it too. And maybe say, hey, I know the CO is busy, I know you're busy, but is this something that maybe you could volunteer to fill out for the CO so that we can get this in place? All of that type of stuff. Again, you're entitled to those ratings as a contractor. And if the government's not doing it, I think it's absolutely appropriate to reach out to them to say, and to explain, we need this rating, please.
So something else that I've been told before is that you can provide narrative. You can provide, we feel that the contracting in this particular area, we had this issue, whether it was supply, there's not even a fault considered, but this thing happened during the performance of the contract between the relationship, the contracting office and our office, we were able to resolve it, stay on timeline. There are things that you can kind of feed into that communication. So one thing to keep in mind is those communications get filed in that contract and contracting officers leave. And if there's any delay because the workload, that that avalanche of things to do keeps sliding those priorities down, and that contracting officer leaves, if you have some sort of written narrative discussion in that contract file, then somebody else coming in that wasn't involved with the entirety of the project, they have some starting point.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that further bolsters the point that maintaining that communication with the contracting officer, hopefully in writing, is all the better, because not only is it going to help address performance issues, but you're absolutely right. It always happens that contracting officers seem to leave.
Especially military projects where the enlisted are 2-year rotation.
and never at the at a great time too. And sometimes, I'm going to say usually, but that's probably skewed by, again, my anecdotal experience of coming in usually when there's a problem. But sometimes it happens that the person that comes in maybe has a different tact or less tact, or
colored by their own previous experience.
Exactly right.
Right.
Maybe isn't as easy to work with as the other contracting officers.
Or not happy to be given this job of cleaning up everybody else's CPARs.
Right. Exactly right.
So keep that in mind as well. One thing that made me think, and you brought in the parental voice, is if any of you have siblings and you were the good sibling, how many times did your parents tell you good job versus dealing with the one that just got called into the principal's office?
Right.
So keep that in mind. Keep that when you're having those successful, keep that communication through the end, keep that written. Yeah. And again, if you're not sure how to do that, get that help.
Yeah, exactly right.
Here we have this experienced individual here.
Yeah, sometimes folks think that the good jobs are implied in the fact that there wasn't well, you did a bad job here.
Correct.
And so but that's not always the case.
So
that's not the case with CPARs. Yeah.
No news is bad news.
It certainly can be, yeah, absolutely. And so especially if, again, you've performed pretty well under the contract and you've got a bid coming up, that's exactly right. Now, if you've performed not so well under the contract and the CO is delayed in putting in the CPAR, that could be a bank error in your favor, so to speak. I mean,
strategy is important.
So keep that in mind as well.
And that's where the communication, you might want to highlight the things that did go well.
Exactly.
Because sometimes there is just personality.
Exactly.
I hear stories too. I'm sure your experience is much more relevant than mine. So one other thing that I really wanted to address is when small businesses are coming in and they're doing these contracts that are under that threshold. So say in construction, 750, it sounds like a minimum amount when you're, when it goes up to these $100 million jobs. But if you're starting off and you're under that threshold, so they're not required to do CPAR, but you need to build that, how can you start requesting? How can you build?
Yeah, and that's a great question. I think, again, just asking the contracting officer, if you can't get them for those particular opportunities, if the CO just isn't necessarily willing to do a CPAR for contracts that fall under that value. If you're bidding on future opportunities, maybe see if there's a way to do like a PPQ, a past performance questionnaire, instead of a CPAR rating, where that way you're giving that contracting officer, hey, here's this 2-page evaluation form. And contracting officers see PPQs all the time. But if it's an opportunity where maybe there's not a CPAR that's issued and you've done well under it, maybe see if the solicitation will allow, or if the contracting officer will allow for PPQs to be submitted instead.
So that was actually my next question. So thank you. Because often I've seen solicitations, working with clients, and it's, yes, past performance is an evaluation factor, and it doesn't necessarily provide any sort of PPQ, that past performance questionnaire form. And so maybe you don't have any published accessible past performance rating. How can you incorporate? Can you suggest or ask if they have a form? Do you create your own? How do you slide that in there if that technical?
I think off the top of my head, I want to say that most agencies have a standard PPQ form, I believe, that they're going to use. That is, usually when we see PPQs, they all include much of the same information. So I think that there's a standard form, but I'm not 100% sure on that. I mean, if they don't, I guess there's nothing wrong with proposing one to the contracting officer.
Because I have seen like 5 or 6 for one agency. We were going through old solicitations and they had all kinds of variations, and it's like, which one do we use?
Right. And maybe what they have is a standard kind of template that contracting officers can use, but then they get to kind of modify it for the specific circumstances of their contract.
Absolutely. And don't forget the whole idea for you guys of communicating that pre-solicitation, that question and answer, on getting some sort of formatted way of providing past performance, is you're making it easy for that evaluation of past performance if you can submit data and just make sure that they're not relying on what is accessible through CPARs.
Right, exactly right. Exactly. And then even if you don't, say the government doesn't, you know, if nothing else, I say put the information in a past performance volume. You know, even if they don't have a CPAR rating, you're giving the government information. And once you've kind of rung the bell, it's hard to unring it, so to speak.
True.
So give them something. Don't necessarily, you know, roll over and say, I don't really have any past performance. I think something's better than nothing.
Absolutely. I actually even wrote here, don't just accept and do nothing.
Right.
Absolutely. That's one of those things of, you know, expanding your experience and becoming that better contracting officer, because really that experience isn't just what you do on the job, it's that proposal process of getting the job. So all of this is very applicable as for building your company's experience. First, you got to get the jobs.
Yeah. And how can you make the contracting officer's life easier? I mean, how do you bring that value add as a contractor? Yes, good performance is part of that equation, but that's kind of the bare minimum. I mean, when the government contracts with somebody, they're expecting that contractor to do a good job under the project. That's kind of part and parcel of winning that contract. What can you do to go above and beyond that in a way that provides value to the government while hopefully helping yourself? And keep in mind, we talked about too, management is one of the key factors under a CPAR rating. You know, you need to make sure that you're visible to the contracting officer and that you're providing these solutions for them, especially if they benefit you. But, you know, I mean, that can all be part of this evaluation too. What's your value add?
And honestly, one of that biggest ways is just that good communication. And it's an assumed. We're getting things done. They know we're getting things done. Especially when you have that technical rep or that COR, you don't know what they're telling the contracting officer. You don't know if they're having coffee once a week. And if you're relying on that information to go past that COR to the contracting officer, and you're not providing. So again. All right, everyone, see how much I will take over the mic if you don't ask questions. We've lost a few of our audience. I know we're getting close to that lunchtime. Anyone else want to chime in? Comments, questions? Again, if you just want to click that raise hand, I'll be glad to unmute you from the control side. And we're having a great conversation here.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the things I really shorted you on is I did not introduce you properly. And I can hear my speech teachers from years ago, my past performance on that is failing horribly as we speak. But if you want to take a moment, introduce yourself here at the end, while we have those that are, other than just here's your contact information, but what's your background? How did you get started in government contracting?
Sure. Well, I got started right when I left law school. I moved down to the Phoenix area and I started working with a firm. It was a large firm, and one of the partners that I got hooked up with down there was a former JAG officer. And as part of his practice, he did some, but not a whole heck of a lot, or it certainly wasn't the major part of his practice, some government contracts. And I kind of did enough to get my toes wet in it and realized that it was interesting as far as legal practices go. I mean, don't get me wrong, there are certainly some that are more interesting than government contracts. But it was very interesting. And then when we moved back to Kansas City after my son was born, I started with a firm that did exclusively federal government contracting with small businesses, and then worked there for several years. And after kind of some, I'll say some internal changes at the firm, and then also between COVID and just realizing that, hey, I wanted to run my own practice. You know, I work with small businesses every day, and I respect them. And that, you know, that entrepreneurial spirit, I kind of choked on that phrase, but I share it in a lot of ways. And I'm able to learn from them the kind of joys and the struggles of owning a business and working through that process. And so, you know, along with some colleagues here last year, in fact, today is what, the 26th? we are 2 days away from our firm's official 1 year anniversary. So we decided to open up our firm and still work with federal government contractors and exclusively work with small businesses in the space. And it's been a great opportunity. I mean, like I said, I learn a lot from them as a business owner, and we really do try to be a value. I mean, I mentioned value add. We try to be a value add to our clients, not just by helping them with their legal problems, but by doing our best to kind of understand what their goals are.
Oh, absolutely.
And seeing how we might get federal contracting to fit into that.
Thank you. So Denise, I see your comment. It says you've been very helpful. Thank you. Thank you both very much. Thank you so much, Denise. Appreciate it. Well, if we have no other questions, I could sit and chat forever, but I'm sure we should move on with our day, especially here in Alaska, where we're so rapidly running out of summer that those priority lists, grow with that absence of sunlight each day. It's like, no, move faster. So at this point in time, I'm going to do a final call for questions. And again, Denise, thank you for the comment. If you think of anything after the fact, we have the contact information here on the screen for you. If you were unable to download the handouts, just reach out to me, email me, and I'll make sure to get those to you so that you have Matt's contact information. And at this point in time, thank you everyone for making it today, and I'm going to go ahead and close out the webinar.